So thanks for being here tonight. It's a huge honor to be in conversation with Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz, who is here to discuss her new book, Not a Nation of Immigrants, Cellular Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion. My name's Liberty, and I'm a member of the Firestorm Collective. We're a 13-year-old cooperative that operates a feminist bookstore and social movement space in Southern Appalachia on Cherokee land. And since the beginning of COVID, we've been hosting events like this one online. And while it's disappointing not to be able to be with you all in person, the online format has offered some opportunities for collaborations across borders and at a distance. And that's the case for the event tonight. So I'm very appreciative of that. If you haven't already, please connect with us on social media and check out our online catalog. We do ship books anywhere in the United States for just $1. So Roxanne might be best known for authoring An Indigenous People's History of the United States in 2014, but she's been active in Indigenous movements for over 40 years and is a founding member of the women's liberation movement in the 1960s, which is actually where I first encountered her work. At California State University of Hayward, Roxanne helped develop the departments of ethnic studies and women's studies. And she's authored more than a dozen books, many of which you can find in our store. And tonight we're also excited to be joined by Brandon Benallie. Brandon is a founding member of K'é Infoshop Collective in so-called Window Rock, which is on Diné land. K'é Infoshop is an anarchist, feminist, and communist project engaged in mutual aid and consciousness raising in support of Black and Indigenous liberation. This event tonight will be just 1 hour long, and Not a Nation of Immigrants includes enough rich content that we could really talk for days about it. So consider this a teaser and be sure to pick up a copy of the book if you haven't already. We will be taking questions towards the end of the hour, but you can use the Q&A function in order to go ahead and get your thoughts down and your questions in as we go along. So Roxanne and Brandon, it's a huge honor to have you both here. Thank you so much for joining me. And Brandon, I guess I'll pass to you to kind of introduce yourself and say a little more about K'é Infoshop Collective.
Oh, thank you. So I'll introduce myself in my language, which Diné people are notorious for doing. It might take up the entire 5 minutes. Yaite, K'é Brandon Benallie Ńdeeshgizh, Kenyani Diné Nashlon, Jose Tachini Bashishin, Honagati Diné Dashiche Adatrobaha Diné Dashinele, Kitzili Ado T'iists'óóz Ńdeeshgizh Date Nasha, Diné Hastin Akut Ego Nishle. So Yaite everyone, Yaite could be translated to this moment between us is good, or this moment between the universe and us is good. I am a co-founder of the K'é Infoshop, which was founded, the collective itself was founded in 2013, and our space officially opened in 2017. So the K'é Infoshop, why we chose an Infoshop as opposed to a community center is that we are not just a service-oriented space or collective. We're not a nonprofit reallocating funds to meet the material needs of our relatives. We are stridently anti-colonial, anti-capitalist with anarchist and communist tendencies. Our work is guided by queer indigenous feminisms from a Diné perspective. Our Diné lifeways continue to thrive despite almost 500 years of resistance to colonization and imperialism. We seek to undo the harm of hyper-individualism for the sake of being a productive proletariat. We seek to reaffirm our natural rights to a healthy and dignified life for all beings above and below the surface. So with that being said, my partner Ed Millicody and I, we co-founded the space and have been providing mutual aid and direct support to the unsheltered or to those within our territories whose abilities to live healthy, dignified lives have been taken from them or temporarily displaced or dispossessed from them. And so at the K'é Infoshop, we not only just provide material needs such as free internet and building our public library, but we're also looking to raise or bring more awareness to I wouldn't say a radical, well, I guess you would say a radical movement towards Indigenous and Black liberation. And that's been our focus since we've opened this space, and we continue to navigate the realities of doing that, especially for colonized peoples. And we've had the true honor of hosting Roxanne there before. We had her name at our InfoShop space, which is, I would say, is a cozy space. But she packed the room, and then we had people outside, standing outside, watching from the windows, listening to her as well. And so it's great to be back, in her virtual presence again, as well as you all. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Brandon, for that. Those comments and bringing up my visit there. I think it was in November 2017. Very memorable. It was
Yes.
A lovely evening, and my name was up in a marquee, just like a Hollywood movie. It was wonderful. I don't know how that came about, but there it was, and it was a lovely time. And I so appreciate the work that you and your comrades are doing. And thank you, Liberty, for arranging this, and for Firestorm Books and everyone involved in making this event possible. And greetings to everyone who's joined us. I look forward to your questions. And I wish I could be in Nashville in person, but that will be another time. I'd like to, since we're in a part of Appalachia, I'd like to read an excerpt from Not a Nation of Immigrants that is close to home in Nashville. It highlights the historical development and features of US settler colonialism. So in the newest iteration of the mythologizing of white Appalachian settlers and their descendants, a book titled Ramp Hollow, The Ordeal of Appalachia, Fordham University historian Stephen Stoll first acknowledges the brutality of the forced removal of indigenous nations from east of the Mississippi, the ethnic cleansing, the forced relocation to Indian territory, and concedes that as Aboriginal nations, indigenous peoples differed from the plight of the Scots-Irish settlers in Appalachia. And he recognizes that Native nations were uprooted and removed by the federal government as peoples, whereas the Scots-Irish settlers were individual settlers who took what Stoll implies was ethnically cleansed vacant land and created their own agrarian civilization and became a people. Stoll then leaves the tragic past of indigenous presence and settler colonial violence and posits a new people. Echoes of James Fenimore Cooper's tales, Last of the Mohegans, the people of the mountains who he claims resemble the peasants of feudal England who experienced foreclosure of the commons and had been provided by their lords. Yet Stoll continually argues that there are parallels in US policy toward what he calls the peasants of Appalachia and the experience of Native nations. He writes, both groups were cast as degenerate races with no capacity for historical progress. Neither Scots-Irish cattle herders nor Chickasaw maize gardeners could be brought into the circulation of capital without shedding their rootedness in locality and their household sufficiency. Indian territorial sovereignty conflicted with the expansion of cotton and slavery. Mountaineer kinship made some of the same kinds of claims on the landscape as home place. Neither group made much sense to an emerging conception of land as a commodity. Most of all, perhaps, both underwent an intellectual dispossession that preceded the one that actually took away the land. I'll mention that my own Dunbar family is from that area. Scots-Irish settlers in Appalachia moved on to Missouri and then Oklahoma, and they're all over the country now. But these are the people, the Scots, who actually were the settler colonial colonizers of Ulster in Ireland, Northern Ireland. Stoll portrays the white, mostly Scots-Irish settlers in the middle and southern Appalachians as subsistent agrarians and hunters. He concedes that they engaged in market exchange, selling livestock and lumber, but claims that they did not become dependent on the cash and credit economy that dominated the rest of the United States. He characterizes them as swiddeners, an anthropological term indicating slash and burn agriculture, another indigenous marker. After drawing a picture of this near idyllic society of Scots-Irish, Stoll launches into a global history of enclosure of the commons. Throughout the book, he applies the already somewhat romanticized histories of the feudal period of the English commons and the enclosure movement that fenced the commons and privatized the land, throwing the peasants into surplus labor force, launching the British capitalist economy. Stoll characterizes the colonial settlers of Appalachia and their descendants as peasants who experienced enclosure with the arrival of coal and timber industries in the late 19th century. The final chapter is titled "The Face of the Commons and the Commoners." He compares this process to the forced removal of all the indigenous peoples east of the Mississippi to Indian Territory, and to the Dawes Act that divided all common native land into marketable allotments. In doing so, Stoll disappears the native and bestows indigeneity upon these settlers. But Stoll didn't create the idea of self-indigenizing white settlers. It is a phenomena that harkens back to the mythologizing of Daniel Boone and the US origin story. Then it took new form in the aftermath of the Civil War when Reconstruction waned, as did the possibilities of Black equality. The mountain people as a pocket of whiteness, still today 90% white, took on a demographic category in the minds of Northern elites when the railroads brought industry into the mountains. The whiteness of the population appeared as unspoiled Americans as opposed to the foreignness of a flood of Eastern and Southern European immigrants arriving. The coal mining industry took over and transformed the white settler population into heroic white miners, while labor organizing and union militancy marked the culture of whiteness. With economic depressions and competition in the coal industry, the Appalachian coal industry waned, as did the labor movement, leaving the mountain people impoverished, many migrating to Cincinnati, Chicago, and other industrial centers. In the late 1960s, the war on poverty turned attention to white poverty in Appalachia. At the intellectual level, development theory that Europe had underdeveloped, the third world, happened at the same time in the 1960s, started being theorized. Out of the thinking on development and underdevelopment, the concept of internal colonization was theorized and became popularized. In general, the designation of internal colony was racialized, indicating the impoverishment and powerlessness of African Americans living in so-called ghettos, as well as Mexican Americans, particularly New Mexico, But anti-poverty scholars and activists also applied it to white Appalachians, coinciding with the revival of self-indigenization. What set off the current Appalachian settler appropriations of indigeneity was the 1962 publication of Night Comes to the Cumberland, a biography of a depressed region by Kentucky lawyer Harry Caudill. In Ramp Hollow, Stephen Stoll praises the book, writing, after the book's publication, Caudill kept Appalachia before the public. In a 1967 article, Caudill wrote, quote, "The colonialist sway of the rest of the world has ended. Only in our Appalachia does it proceed unchecked," unquote. Of course, this was a period when most of the Southern and West Africa remained under the boot of colonialism, and 13 years before Zimbabwe won independence. And of course, Native Americans still colonized land bases, reservations. Caudill called the white people of the Appalachians indigenous mountaineers who have lived in the plateau since the beginning. He went on, much of the pioneer society in this mountainous region had resided in the wilderness for 3 or 4 generations. They had acquired much of the stoicism of the Indians, and inurement of primitive outdoor living had made them almost as wild as the red men. His old woman could endure harsh privations as well as the Indian squaw, and was far more fruitful. He ate the Indians' corn and jerked meat. He wore the Indians' deerskin clothes. He even adopted the tomahawk. And here only, on the rampaging frontier, the white borderman collected scalps and with all the zest of the Choctaw brave. One of the more racist statements in my book. Appalachian scholar Stephen Pearson is one of the few intellectuals from the region to refute the concept of white Appalachians being indigenous and colonized. Exploited by capitalism, they have been, but colonized, they have never been. They are colonialists, settler colonialists. The colonial model, Pearson writes, maintains that white Appalachians positioned as the region's indigenous population are the victims of a form of colonialism analogous to the dominating of American Indian nations. And as such, the colonial model of Appalachia exploitation calls for the decolonization of Appalachia. Pearson notes that the Appalachian case offers an excellent illustration of how settlers can employ indigenization in the late settler colonial context in order to negotiate land claims and other inequalities among white settlers. The Appalachian case shows that even in late settler colonies, Native presence remains an unsettling factor, challenging the legitimacy of ongoing settler occupation. Appalachian scholars developed and refined Caudill's work using the internal colonialism theoretical context, going further than Caudill in portraying white settlers as indigenous peoples. In 1978, scholarly articles were published in the book Colonialism in Modern America, The Appalachian Case, which remains a fundamental text in Appalachian studies. In the flagship essay of the collection written by Helen Lewis and Edward Knipe, the authors refer to the white residents as the indigenous population, while those of the residents who align themselves with the coal companies are designated as, quote, natives who become colonizers of their own people. They write of the so-called colonizers manifesting racism against an indigenous population, referring to the white settler population, which the authors refer to as the colonized. The author analogizes regional development organizations to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, claiming that the white population lives on the Appalachian Reservation. Most disturbing is that Lewis and Knight treat the original invasion of the Scots-Irish squatters as peaceful settlement rather than genocidal violence. They portray an empty landscape that the settlers occupied, the indigenous people somehow having disappeared, with white settlers inheriting indigeneity in the land. In another anthology, Edward Guénon writes of the Appalachian region, quote, whose indigenous Cherokee integrated, educated, and nursed the exiled Celtic arrivals into maturity, wisdom, and community, unquote. Judy Bonds, a well-known activist opposing mountaintop removal, has stated that, quote, we're a distinct mountain culture, and our culture means something. This is a culture that has been handed down to us all the way from the Native Americans. David Weisnad, whom historian Stephen Stoll acknowledges as one of the historians of Appalachia, whose work I read and admired, characterizes his scholarly mission as being one of Frantz Fanon's Native intellectuals in a colony going through decolonization. Another Appalachian scholar, Roger Cunningham, asserts that all Native Appalachian scholarship, including mine, this is quoting Cunningham, is like that of other colonized people in being engaged with history and praxis. Pearson observes that the colonialism model has allowed white liberals within the region to valorize themselves as indigenous leaders in a struggle for decolonization, a supersessionist settler colonial fantasy come to fruition. The recent memoir of Appalachia born J.D. Vance, Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir of family and culture in crisis, have revived the mythology. Vance is a wealthy, self-identified political conservative, now running for the Senate, a graduate of Yale Law School and a Silicon Valley investor. Hillbilly Elegy was a sensation from its release in 2016 with Oprah Winfrey's endorsement. It remained on all best-selling books lists for 2 years in hardback, selling 1 million copies. Although there were some negative reviews, it received critical attention from the conservative National Review to National Public Radio, from right to left, as well as all major newspapers and media. And in the fall of 2020, Hillbilly Elegy premiered as a major motion picture. Vance's memoir is the second 21st century Scots-Irish memoir. After that, a former US Navy Secretary and US Senator James Webb, titled Born Fighting, How the Scots-Irish Shaped America, published in 2005. Vance is critical of his Appalachian family and community, invoking the self-blaming culture of poverty rhetoric. But as with Webb, he is extremely proud of his Scots-Irish ancestry. Like many Scots-Irish men in the United States, both are proud of their service in the US Marine Corps, which is packed with Scots-Irish descendants. Webb's story is more interesting as he traces the Scots-Irish trek from the Appalachians to the Arkansas Ozark region, where he grew up. The majority of white settlers in Missouri, Oklahoma, and Texas were also Scots-Irish, as was my Dunbar family. Vance writes that there is an ethnic component in his story, noting that ethnic differences extend beyond skin color. He writes, I may be white, but I do not identify with the WASP of the Northeast. Instead, I identify with the millions of working class white Americans of Scots-Irish descent who have no college degree, unquote. He with a Yale degree, MFA. He describes the entrenched poverty among his ancestors who were day laborers in the slave economy, not slavers. However, many of them were slavers. Then they were sharecroppers, then machinists and mill workers. Americans call them hillbillies, rednecks, or white trash. I call them neighbors, friends, and family. Vance edges toward Appalachian indigeneity, remarking, apparently magically, when the first wave of Scots-Irish immigrants landed in the New World in the 18th century, they were deeply attracted to the Appalachian Mountains. The term deeply attracted is deeply inappropriate conceptualization of the genocidal settler invasion of the agricultural homelands of several indigenous nations, particularly the Cherokee, who were self-sufficient farmers living in villages throughout the region for 10,000 years. However, actual indigenous people do not exist in Vance's story or in any of these stories. Indigenous peoples, African Americans, and actual history do appear in the 2019 book of essays that critique Vance's hillbilly elegy. Appalachian historian T.R.C. Hutton notes that Vance implies that whiteness is the absence of race. And Vance uses the term hillbilly, which embodies whiteness, a term rarely applied to a person of color. And he uses hillbilly interchangeably with Scots-Irish. Legal scholar Lisa Pruitt writes, reflecting the common practice of white default or transparency, and in the fashion of Appalachian studies, Vance elects merely to imply race. Even though the race is white, the use of the hillbilly label permits Vance to suggest a downtrodden minority. In a review of the 2020 Ron Howard movie based on hillbilly elegy, writer Ellen Wayland Smith, who is white and hails from Appalachia, asks the pertinent question, quote, why does Vance's memoir strike such a sensitive national nerve? That's the question. Donald Trump had been campaigning for the presidency in the year before Vance's book appeared, using racist language and catering to Appalachians, promising to bring back the coal industry. During Trump's contiguous rise in Obama's ostensibly post-racial America, Vance's memoir arguably served a similar role, tacitly excusing Trump's most egregious racist dog whistles. Vance reassured readers that his hillbillies' animus had nothing to do with race. So that's quite an indictment of the region. I hope some locals are here to argue with me.
That was a passage that really struck me, and it's early in the book, but you really got my attention with that. I will say that while the idea that internalized colony maybe has fallen out of favor, the threads of that narrative are still so strong in the region, and on the left as well. So yeah, that's a great passage from your book, and one that I really appreciated, and forced me to think about the region in a new way. I will also say that it strikes me as something of a parallel to another phenomena in my part of like Southern Appalachia, which is the erasure of enslaved peoples. It's also quite common, I think, in the mountains to talk about slavery as if it only existed in the Piedmont or the sort of like lowlands where like large scale plantations existed. But of course we know that that's not true. And there's a wealth of evidence to show that the Scotch Irish and others in Southern Appalachia had enslaved people. But I think that there's a similar kind of whitewashing of that history.
You know, there was a wonderful play that was actually a 6-hour play. It had to be done in 2 nights, and it won the Pulitzer Prize, but it never opened on Broadway. It was Seattle playwright. But it is a really important play to read. You can get the script. It's called The Kentucky Cycle, and it goes through that. And of course, it makes very clear. And he based it on meticulous research of enslavement. Many people, I mean, slavery work, there were large plantations, but the average slave owner in, what became the Confederate States, owned 2 slaves, so many people, because there are a lot of slaves, many people owned slaves if they could, it wasn't as if it wasn't a desire, but it was also a reality. And of course, there are Black voices like Henry Louis Gates, who grew up in Appalachia and has an oral history, of his family, and many other African Americans.
And I'm so glad that you read this chapter because it ties directly into a question that I had for you. Because in this chapter specifically, you mentioned the irony of Irish settlers participating in settler colonization themselves, for they were also refugees from British imperialism and colonization, this self-indigenization, you say. And I feel the same way about Gallup, New Mexico, which has one of the largest per capita populations of the Palestinian people. I think it has 800 to 1,000 Palestinian people who live in a predominantly native settlement. So this irony, to me is proof that identity is something to be possessed like property. And we can discuss this more later on, and specifically when I talk about queer indigenous feminisms. But to me, the settler identity is vehemently rejected to the more valuable capital producing identity of being a US citizen or an American, so to speak. So with so much of our discourse now centered on identity politics these days, from the so-called left and right, do you think identity hinders or bolsters our movements, our struggle towards liberation from imperialism?
Well, I think, of course, I was part of the movement that started ethnic studies, which is now, came out of Black nationalism, Native Red Power, Latino identity, first is Chicano, Chicano identity. And there are some land issues there with Aztlán, the claiming of Aztlán, which, well, your people and the Hopi and Utes actually live and in there.
Yeah, we've had interesting conversations with folks about Aztlán as well. Productive discourse.
Yeah. But I do want to make a correction. The Irish Catholic refugees who came were, I have a whole chapter on them. They were the colonized. The Scots-Irish were the colonizers of Ulster. So they were not oppressed people at all. They came for land. There wasn't much, when they started coming in the early 1700s, some had come before, but when they started coming in some numbers, they were very practiced settler colonialists. They had been scalping the heads of, they cut off the heads, they would put them on poles to terrify the Irish Catholic population. So they brought that with them. They brought the skills of the settler with them. So it's actually one of the most vicious ethnic cleansing that ever took place, was their ethnic cleansing of Appalachia, a lot of which took place before Britain had even given any British citizen the right to go into that area. So yeah, identity politics is, there are positives and negatives. I think it's interesting to me how, studying immigration in this book, and really questioning, how do immigrants become settlers? How do they develop the settler mentality? Because they come to something already formed. They're not responsible for what the settlers set up here. They come all, I mean, the majority really come as refugees, either economic or from wars that the United States creates, manufactures refugees all over the third world all the time. All those people in Central America pouring in, comes from decades of occupations of those countries and clandestine war throughout the 1980s there that devastated the population, left it in ruins. So they come pouring in. And how we can work to block immigrants becoming settlers, to pull them to the side of native land claims, of understanding US history. So that's really the purpose of my book, is talking to immigrants, especially immigrants from the third world. And many of the memoirs that have been coming out from immigrants from Africa and South Asia and Asia, East Asia, Philippines, are very, very knowledgeable and sensitive about Native claims and their own role as immigrants. And so I think there's a lot of solidarity to be harvested. And I really wanted to make that point, because the Americanization process in the 19th century really ground up people and made them be anti-Black racists. These were first the Irish, who became the worst of the, they became the police, they became slave patrollers, the lowest kinds of jobs, these Irish refugees. And they and the Catholic Church actually pushed them in these directions. And then when the Eastern Europeans and Southern Italians, mainly from Sicily, very darker people, Irish with blue-eyed blondes mostly, and spoke English, but non-English speaking Jewish and Slavic and Sicilians coming were horribly treated. They were made to sit in the Black sections of churches, even in Catholic churches, even though most of them were Catholic, and then there were Jews. And so the oppression was deep, but there, especially Theodore Roosevelt's before and during and after his presidency, developed this Americanization process. He was a real Anglo-Saxon racist, against really any other Europeans even. He only accepted Germans and Scandinavians as any kind of equals, and had questions about the Celts even. But once it was, industry needed all these workers, so they put in place, they used Columbus, and Columbus as a Catholic, and Columbus as first founder of the United States, to give that to as an identity. So that's why we have Italians today fighting to keep Columbus Day. It's the day given to them as first founders, first settlers, like the Appalachians. So to bring that out and make that clear to people what's happening to them, I think at least for the young people among these people, descendants of these immigrants, don't want to play that role, won't want to play that role when they understand it, but they really have no way of understanding it unless it's spelled out. So that's what I tried to do in the book. And yeah, I think identity politics is so-called is limited, of course, but it's just limited to that and has no class component or analysis or colonial, colonial context. Then it's just a kind of narcissism that is not very productive.
That's something that we see at the Infoshop well, that nationalism is just really, or patriotism is just really narcissism with a flag on it. Because this identity of, being an American is sort of like the quote unquote the gold standard of identities, right? It's the, you know, seen as an American first. And I think that's what really defangs and declaws a lot of these movements, because we've mistaken identity along with representation, like we see right now with Indigenous people in seats of Congress, and even our Secretary of Interior, Deb Haaland, who's an Indigenous person herself, overseeing vast amounts of land that's current in contention for Indigenous people. And so we're seeing, I think, the identity, this ruse of representation being used as something as a liberation affirming tool, when in reality, myself and maybe even others could see it as just another tactic, strategy of assimilation into this American identity, this overall arching identity, what it means to be an American. So, and I think another part of your book that I really liked was how you made a distinction between, or how you remarked about the enslaved people, the Black slaves revolts, possibly being the first labor movement strikers. You know, of course, the conditions, you know, today it's more about livable wages and getting healthcare, but back then it was more about freedom, right? It's about, you know, and so I always like that distinction, because, and the reason why I bring that up is that they could be considered the first Black or the proletariat force on this continent, but also there's a needed distinction between the discourse of what a proletariat is. You know, as Indigenous people, we're not often seen as, you know, a proletariat. We didn't go through from a feudal society to a capitalist society that we are now. You know, and I appreciate the distinction that that most Indigenous societies had always been horizontal, and or horizontal society, and not really built upon enslavement of other peoples. Although that did occur, I'm not saying that Indigenous societies are perfect or to be infantile, you know, to be patronized as a so-called utopian society. But I'm wondering if that makes slave revolts around the world basically labor movements that precede capitalism. And so I thought that was always an interesting comment that you had. And you also had another comment, and I was wondering if I had missed it in the book. I mean, I went through it twice, but is there like any distinction or correlations you can make about the Tohono O'odham people, where a border is literally built between their land and ancestral territories, and you know what that says about migration versus immigration, and how that affects the Tohono O'odham people within the so-called Mexico and U.S. border.
Yeah, actually, there is a section in the book, in the chapter called The Border, which I think is chapter 8, of how the border cuts through that border, that I call it a illegal and artificial border, that was made by, you know, the gun at the head of the government in Mexico to cede the northern half of Mexico to the United States. So it cuts many, actually, I think there's some 30 or so different native communities that are cut, you know, are separated. So that especially with the, you know, tightening of the border, it's very, the Tohono O'odham and others, they have ceremonies on both sides. And there was a time, you know, in the 60s and the movements where they actually, and also the Haudenosaunee and other Native people on the Canadian border gained, you know, their demands to be able to cross without going to border security and all. But of course, with the announcement of terrorism in 2001, all of this closed, you know, and it's gotten worse and worse. So you have a lot of incidents where people have their farms right on the border, or have their wells for water. So they have to go to a border station and go through and then drive over to the other side to collect their water. Of course, only from the United States can they do that. There's no way, you know, those under Mexican sovereignty are allowed to come the other way. So a lot of the burden falls on the Native people in the North to keep things going. And it's becoming more and more difficult. Imagine waiting in those lines in Tijuana or in southern Arizona and all, you know, the Texas border. The other thing the border does is just ruin the ecology, you know, of this area. It's a very delicate desert and semi-arid ecology with animals and the more they put these fences up, the more animals can't go on their regular migrations, and they die off too. So it's a, you know, it's a very nasty border that we have to, there's a new book out about there are several new books out about the border that really spell out these things that I had access to, and some have come out since I published the book and didn't have access to. But I think we really need to educate ourselves in what that border is all about, and how immigration is, it's the same for every single administration. It's the one thing that never changes, just like defense spending and the military. War is, you know, equally supported. Next war, China even. Everyone agrees in politics, and this immigration policy, the very first immigration law, 1882, was exclusion. It was named Exclusion of Chinese. And a few years later, the second one expanded that to all Asians, excluded. Everything was excluded. John F. Kennedy, who was the child of immigrants and invented the term, not a nation of immigrants, of course, in a 1958 book, he did initiate. He died before it could go through, so it went through in 1965, the Heller Act of opening up immigration to non-Europeans for the first time. It doesn't mean people weren't coming, but they were undocumented and contingent and very vulnerable to exploitation and deportation.
I'm glad you brought that up, the ecological effects of settler colonization in regards to borders. And I like how you brought up the water, how on the so-called US side, the Tohono people have to get water from the wells on their side and take it to their relatives south of that border. And in the larger scale of that, you know, Indigenous people are fighting for our rights to the Colorado River. Within the so-called Arizona, it's the first state to have a federally mandated water restriction, where they had to start using 20% less water now. It's the first state, first federally restricted state. So this ecological crisis, which has been accelerated by settler colonization, also affects our relatives in the global South, because we've been in litigation. The Navajo Nation specifically has been in litigation with the states of Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and California, and also the state of Mexico, because Mexico has ceased to get water from the Colorado River as well. And that's only going to continue to exacerbate. You know, I think I often tell people that, you know, immigration from an Indigenous perspective is a natural, like to permanently settle someplace, because in our history as Indigenous people, specifically Diné people, we've always been a migrant society. In our stories and our lifeways as Diné people, that, and a testament to our ways of the net is that we also accumulate stories from other people as well, aka take them from other tribes and make them our own. So a lot of what Diné Lifeways also includes, portions of that which could be published stories as well, but it always talks about migration, and it always talked about, the harms that could affect not only yourself as a person, but your society and your families and your communities if you were to permanently settle someplace, which is why we're always on the move, whether we're following weather patterns or so on. But I really enjoyed this conversation with you, and I wish we could talk so much more, especially about the fiscal military state, and get into the more of the nerdy side of the birth of the US capitalist state. But I know we're limited on time, and your time is very valuable to us.
Thanks so much, Brandon. Are there any questions from our participants?
Yeah, I would welcome folks to go ahead and submit any questions that they may have. We probably have time for one or two before we wrap up. This book really is just such an incredible wealth of history. I love the way that it is episodic, and the way that the chapters cover different groups. Yeah, I found it to be extremely eye-opening. And as a East Coaster, I really did not appreciate much of the history of the Southwest. So it's quite an education for me.
Thank you.
Well,
I did want to endorse Brandon's, I didn't respond to it, but I agree that enslaved Africans were the first proletariat. But I think they also were, the Cotton Kingdom was the source, not the industrial Northeast, but by 1840, the United States already had the greatest GDP in the world. And it was based on a very complex industrial system, the Cotton Kingdom, cotton and textile mills, and trade with Britain. So I think, there's a book by Walter Johnson on this River of Dark Dreams. It's extremely important. So I think definitely slave revolts were labor uprisings, but the added onus of one's body being a commodity. This is what's unique. And what is so traumatic, generations of people whose bodies were literally commodities to be abused, used, worked to death, sold on the auction block. By 1840 also, the greatest asset, property asset, greater than all other assets put together, was the African body, the enslaved African body, the slaves.
Well, it is true that we are reaching the end of our time together. Maybe if you'd permit me to ask one more question that I think might be a good big picture question related to not only this book, but much of your work. And this is something that I thought about while reading Not a Nation of Immigrants. I loved the chapter on Alexander Hamilton. And so it prompted me to go and look at Alexander Hamilton's Wikipedia page. And I was horrified to discover that it presents an extremely different and I think outdated perspective on Hamilton, kind of uncritically endorsing the idea that Hamilton was an abolitionist. And I guess that led me to wonder kind of like, why is it that history is so hard to reappraise? And ultimately, like, what is the role of everyday people who are not historians in revisioning history and reassessing the past?
Yeah, it's a problem. There are so the education system has certainly improved with mass movements in that direction, by Native peoples, by African Americans, by Latinos, by women, and it has improved. But U.S. historians, I did my graduate work. I did all of my. I was a history major from undergraduate through graduate school. I always avoided U.S. history because I didn't know how to deconstruct it, but I knew it was simply propaganda. It was like, Tsarist Russia or something, where, they took notes from the king of what the historians had to say. And yet US citizens who are historians of other countries are very good historians. It's not a lack of capability. But the people who go into US history in the past, it's very hard to get Native people in history. Jennifer Benallie is, she needs to write a book on the history profession because she went through it. And at that colonization place of University of New Mexico. But she's in American Studies now. She couldn't stand it. So it's been really hard to break down. There are a lot of really great young historians in the pipeline, but not enough Native Americans. Very good African American historians. Chicanos really, really emphasized the history field. And in that field, there's wonderful literature. But it hasn't really made it into the main books. Like, no one touches the founders. Chicanos don't have, that interest necessarily. So yes, the founders are slave owners or merchants dealing in slavery. Everything was about slavery in the Western Hemisphere. All economics was based on slavery. And of course, Alexander Hamilton came from the epicenter, the Caribbean. So the idea that, of course, I'm surprised Wikipedia hasn't caught up at least with the New York Times, revealing that, well, yes, Alexander Hamilton did trade in slaves and he owned slaves. He was married into one of the big slave owning families in the colonies, the Schuyler's of upstate New York, Buffalo, huge plantations they had, and they were slave traders. That was the economy. Everyone was in it, but they just grew. They were the wealthiest people in the whole of the colonies. He married into that family. He kept the books. He traded in there. He managed the slave trade for that family. So that's just a fact. It's like, it's not some theory or something that he wrote. And that abolitionist society was a very upper class thing that people, there was no binding thing, but they said possibly at death they would emancipate their slaves, they would treat them better. It wasn't abolitionism. It was called an anti-slavery society, but it was basically a social club, without any teeth at all. And their only ideas, if they did emancipate, is deport them to places where they had never been before, to Africa. And they did, at the Liberian thing, they did deport many, but yeah, so, the founders are these, these untouchables. Now historians will say, well, there are warts. They call them warts, and a few bad things. But it's not about bad and good, it's about colonialism without that context. And that's what US historians absolutely refuse to deal with. Is this the United States is not only imperialist. They used to say when I was in graduate school in the 60s, US imperialism had a short time in the invasion of the Pacific and the occupation of the Philippines and the Caribbean, Cuba and Puerto Rico, and half the Caribbean. But then it was over. And of course, US was imperialist from the very beginning. It had warships on the North African shores in 1806, 1808, the Barbary Wars against Arabs. That's where the Marines get their song, Follow the Marines, from the shores, from the halls of Montezuma, the war in Mexico, when they wrote this hymn, to the shores of Tripoli. Now, why doesn't someone say, hey, where's Tripoli? What's Tripoli got to do with the Marines? They were there in 1806 and 1808, 2 wars to open free trade, that is force. It took them 6 years altogether to force the Sultan of what is now Libya to allow the U.S. trade. So they had warships. They had warships all over the world. You know, even right at independence. It wasn't a little struggling, you know, colonies that became states and pulled themselves up by the bootstrap. They had in the Northwest Ordinance, which was even before the Constitution itself, but then was folded into it, there were maps to reach the Pacific. They wanted the China trade. They enunciated that. So US historians lie. They leave out things, you know. I mean, they don't say, oh no, that didn't happen. It's just not there. And that makes it really hard, you know, to supplement it unless you insist on doing it. I do think that Native Americans have you know, your ordinary 8th grade educated Lakota or Diné or Pueblo have a more accurate version of US history than any US historian I know, because they know from oral history the reality. So it's very important that Native voices and Native scholars are being churned out, and most of them, maybe not all, most of them are very dedicated to bringing their skills home, and also in telling the truth, you know, about these histories.
Thank you so much, Brandon and Roxanne. I'm sorry that we don't have more time together this evening, but it's been an absolute pleasure. And I hope that we'll get a chance to speak again.
Thank you so much. It was really wonderful to be with you, and you, Brandon. You take care of yourselves.
You too, Roxanne. You too, Liberté. Thank you all so much. And not to take the last word, but I just wanted to say something I think is very important, is that through kinship, we are strong. And I was always taught that the deep roots of the earth will always find each other. And I think with Liberté and Roxanne and folks who are watching this now, these deep roots of the earth are finding each other again, and they'll always find each other. So thank you all.
Thank you. Wonderful way to end. Thank you, Brandon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Liberté.
Have a great evening. Good night. Thanks for joining us, everyone.